Thanks very much for letting us speak today. So in today's talk, we're going to give an overview of what our problem area is, so what is phylogenetics, and then we're going to talk briefly about our project, sort of the kind of things we're trying to do, and then we're going to give a view of kind of who are the people who will use our software and how that influences the decisions we make, and then just briefly we're going to talk about some of the challenges of using Haskell for a project like this. So to start off, what is phylogenetics? So here's a picture I got from Twitter. It's a phylogenetic tree of emoji parrots. And I'm going to introduce some terminology and then come back to this picture. So in phylogenetics, we have a taxon set, and in this case, it's emoji parrots. So these are the things that are on the leaves here. They're the taxon set. And then we have character observations. So in this case, we can think of something like the color of the parrots. So here, these are kind of reddish parrots. This is orange-ish, blue. These are green. And that could be like what we would call a character observation. And just to say more generally, the taxon set could be a group of organisms. It could be languages. It could be something very general. Similarly, these character observations are colors of feathers, but it could be other morphological characteristics. So it could be something like beak length or something to do with talons or something like that. And it could also be kind of DNA characters. So it could be at this base site, what is the DNA base you can see? And importantly here, characters have some notion of metric or transition cost. So for the DNA characters, it's easier to say, so you might have a cost of mutation. So at this site, you might mutate from A to G or C to T or something, and that has a cost associated with it that's kind of empirically observed or maybe a hypothesis. And that's important for what I'm going to talk about. And then finally, you have this tree, and the tree is meant to represent a hypothetical history of, given the character observations, of what is the evolutionary thing that led to these emoji parrots. And I'm going to talk about it next, but that's, in general, we want kind of the best tree to explain the relationships between our data. So the key problems we think about, or I think about for today, are the tree alignment problem. And this is a problem where you're given a tree, and you're given a taxon set, and you're given character observations on that, and then you want to extend those characters to the internal nodes of the tree, and you want your extension to be minimal. And so what that means is, I said before, characters have a transition cost, and we want to add up the transitions over the whole tree. So I'll go back to this example. So here, we want to, our character observation is color, and we want to go over the tree and assign to these internal nodes colors. So here, these are all red, so we should definitely assign something sort of reddish. Here, we're between orange and red, so we can assign something kind of orangish red. Here, we're green, so we should do something green, or here we're green, maybe, I'm not sure. So that's the idea. Extend these character observations to the hypothesized ancestors, and then that's like the tree alignment problem. And some comments about that. So in general, if we have a discrete number of states, so like DNA bases, then there are well-known algorithms, which is basically the example I just gave. You just make the best guess at each stage. So names here are like Fitch or Sankoff for the algorithm. And you make the best guess at each stage, and that is kind of how you can assign internal characters. But in general, it might be you have DNA sequences, you might have variable length strings of base pairs, and that's kind of an NP-hard problem. And then more generally, there's the generalized tree alignment problem. And in that case, you're given the taxon set, you're given the character observations, but you're not given the tree. And you want to look amongst the space of all trees and all extensions to those trees to find the best, to find a minimal cost. And so this is kind of NP-hard squared. And so in each of these cases, you can think of these as kind of optimality problems where you have the space of characters, or the space of extensions of characters, the space of trees, and you want to search these spaces, and you can think of it as kind of like a machine learning type optimality problem. Okay, so that's the general background for phylogenetics. Now we're going to talk about the overview of our project, and Alex is going to talk about it.
Thank you, Callan. So our software project is called Phylogenetic Component Graphs. It is freely available online. You can just go on GitHub, clone this if you want. I'll just give a brief overview. We've got 37,000 lines of Haskell code, and that's where the main functionality of our code base lies. There's 2 FFI bindings, one to a legacy but highly optimized collection of C code, and then another FFI binding to some C++. So our project has a pretty standard functional workflow. There's a very basic scripting language so that users can specify what they want to do for their phylogenetic search. We then parse a lot of input that the user provides to us. We take all the input the user gave us and we try to unify it into a cohesive and coherent data set. And then we enter this tree search loop that you can see here, where we build a tree, score it, determine how costly that tree is for the tree alignment problem. Then you can mutate the tree and see if there's a less costly neighbor and sort of do an uninformed heuristic search through this tree space. And then after that has happened for a while, whether we've converged on a tree and we can't find any way to improve, or if a certain amount of time has passed that the user specified and they just want the best answer we've gotten so far, we will stop searching for the tree and we will serialize some output that is meaningful to the user, they can consume in other software or look at directly to help with their evolutionary biology. So it's a pretty standard, purely functional flow here. You got some I/O at the beginning to get the input in, you do a bunch of pure computations in the middle, and then you get some I/O to get the results out. There are some novel features of PCG. The taxa are very abstract along with the characters. So other software tends to focus on biological taxa, biological character observations, and they sort of special case certain things like DNA characters or morphological characters. But we took a more abstract approach to our software architecture, and it allows us to specify anything as taxa or characters. So we've experimented with using different language groups as taxa and phonemes as characters, and also cultural groups as taxa and cultural customs as character observations. And we've generalized in this software from binary trees as output to phylogenetic networks, which allows us to represent more complex evolutionary histories. So as you can see here, this is not a binary tree because we have an in degree 2 node right here. And what that represents in a phylogenetic context is that subtree 4 is going to share some ancestry with subtree 2, and it's also going to share some ancestry with subtree 3, but subtree 3 and subtree 2 are going to have separate ancestries from these 2 nodes. And this can happen if there's some sort of hybridization event. Very common with microorganisms. So that's a brief overview of PCG, but I want to look at how a user might go about doing some phylogenetic search with phylogenetic software. So they'll define our taxa set, they'll collect some character observations, and they'll spend some time defining their search parameters, picking what metrics they want to use for each character. And then they'll put all of that information into some phylogenetic software, and they will start their search. And Sebastian mentioned this a little bit yesterday in his talk, the motivation for this, but you can have large Unix pipelines for creating very large files for this input to phylogenetic software. They can be tens of megabytes, but up to gigabytes in flat, loosely structured data files. So mechanically, the user will create a lot of files before they start their search. They will set a lot of configuration options in their phylogenetic software. And then they'll hit go and wait a very, very long time. And by long time, I mean hundreds of CPU years, potentially. You can put this on a high performance computing cluster and wait months to a year to get your results back. So if you're gonna wait a really long time to get your results back, you're gonna want some assurance before you start that the work you're doing is meaningful and gonna get towards that answer you're looking for, right? So that's involved some of our, it's informed the way we've gone about designing some of our software. Error handling is very important. And we've broken up our computation into a couple phases. There's the importing phase, where we want to get the information off disk, off the network, into our program. And there can be all sorts of I/O errors there. But once we've gotten the information into our system, we want to see if we can understand it, if we can parse these input streams. And if we can understand all the information coming in, we want to try and assemble it together, make sure it's collectively coherent. And if that's the case, we can finally go off and do the phylogenetic search the user wants us to do. And at the end, we'll try and output all the different information they want to disk. And it's important that we don't just fail at the first error we encounter, because phylogenetic software users, they're not exactly computer science experts. So they don't always have perfectly formatted files. They don't always have relative paths set up correctly on the machine. So what we want to do is collect all the errors as possible at once, and then present them all to the user at once. So most people here are probably familiar with the either data type. You can have left B, which usually represents failure, or right A. But there's this other data type that looks strangely similar from the validation package. And you can have a validation EA with failure E or success A. And what sets them apart is their applicative functor instance. You can see in the either case, if we have a left E and we try to apply it to some right-hand value, the computation short circuits. We just get back left E. We don't try to continue our computation at all. But that's not the case with the validation instance of an applicative functor. If we have a failure E1 and we try to apply that to a B value on the right-hand side of apply, we look at B, we evaluate it, and see if B is also a failure. And if it is, we'll use a semigroup operator to combine the two failures together. And that's why there's this semigroup constraint here for validation E. And if we can define all of our errors in terms of semigroups, here's an example of certain input errors defined as a semigroup. We just new typed a non-empty list of error messages, and then we've defined the I/O errors we'd like to handle. Maybe the file's already in use, the permissions are bad, we can't find it on the file system. So at the top here, you'll see a sort of standard exception or error that you might get if you were using either or the built-in exceptions in Haskell. The first thing that messes up, it just tells you about it and stops the computation. It's not a very great user experience because you know you have one error now, and when you resolve this error, you have 0 or more errors you need to worry about. But if we use the validation data structure, it'll collect all the errors from that inputting phase and report them all together. So now we know we have 9 errors. And once we've solved these 9 errors, we have 0 more I/O errors to deal with. We might have some parsing errors, but at least we know the I/O errors they're gone. So we want to make sure that we give meaningful errors back to the user as well. Scientists are really, really smart, but they have a lot of domain expertise in biology, but they don't necessarily have a lot of domain expertise in formatting files. So when we write parsers for these file formats, we want to share as much of the parsing context as we can with the user so that when they encounter a parse error, they can use their domain expertise to go into the file and correct it. We use megaparsec to do this because it has very nice custom error messages. And here's an example of an error message you might be familiar with if you're using a sort of applicative functor-based parsing library. It just tells you where the error occurred and not much about what happened. But if you use a monadic context to thread through your different parsing contexts, so that when you hit an error, you have sort of a nested scope of what you were trying to do, you can create a much more informative parse error for the user. So you can see here that there was probably multiple parrot taxa in this file, and the error happened with this specific taxa, and there might have been multiple lines of sequence data we were trying to parse for this taxa. We know that's on the 33rd line now, and this Q was supposed to be some DNA nucleotide, but Q is not one of them, so it should probably be substituted with a valid character. So Callan will talk about some of the challenges of working with Haskell.
Okay, so this is just sort of some of the other things we've come into in the course of our project that kind of are difficult or create challenges for us. So the first one is memory pressure. So in the kind of examples we might want to run, we might have around 10 to the 5 taxa, or aim to have that amount, and they might have 10 to the 7 character observations. And so we can often get like huge memory footprints, and simultaneously, this means anything we can save on memory kind of is times by this amount. So unpacking for us could be huge, because it could be, saving 1 byte can be saving 10 to the 7 bytes and stuff like that. So that sort of thing is big for us, and it's a constant problem. The other thing is we have kind of unusual data structures that we want. So currently, earlier we had this slide where we talked about the FFI, and we have some C++. And basically all that's doing is giving us a constant time access hash map, which as far as I know, does not exist in the Haskell ecosystem. And we use that for saving computations that we've done along the way. And similarly, as I'll get into later, we were talking about networks. So typically in Haskell, it's easy to represent something like binary trees or rows trees or similar structures like that. But doing something like networks is more complicated. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So other challenges, we use kind of FFI, and that leads to a lot of problems. Sometimes we have linker errors in our compilation when we upgrade GHC. Sometimes you have space leaks on the C side, and all of that stuff is really hard to debug or even just to figure out. And then we have some kind of typical stuff. So we have, problems with doing I/O and problems with text. So as everyone knows, like string is kind of a bad textual representation, but we did have some string in our code for a while. And we have this sort of thing. So we have lazy text and short text for kind of doing string stuff. We use pipes for doing streaming. But all of that's kind of not the nicest experience for just writing some software. And then one more thing, which is a big one for us, is we lack row polymorphism, and there's lots of places in our code where that would be really useful. So we might collect together kind of character sequences or character types, and we want to say this type has these kinds of characters in it, and we might want to extend that in the future or that sort of thing. And so we make a lot of use of this kind of idiom where we have a record type, and it has 2 fields, and then we have this kind of class, and the class is not very type safe, but it gives you a lens into one of those records. And we use kind of these functional dependencies to help the kind of type class inference occur. And so essentially this means a record that might have some field 1 somewhere in it. And we use that as a kind of stand-in for doing row polymorphism where we need it. But it would be nicer to just have direct kind of ability to do row polymorphism. So I'm going to quickly go into a bit more of the example about doing networks. So we want to do networks, which means internally we can have nodes which have 2 parents and a single child. And the kinds of things we want to have fast lookup on nodes, so at least logarithmic, but probably better. We want to be able to kind of work easily with subgraphs. And we want to be able to do 2 kinds of traversal. We want to be able to traverse from leaf to root and from root to leaf. So you remember earlier when I was talking about extending characters to a tree, and I was going from the leaves and I was kind of reasoning upwards. And then at the end of that, I might go from the root and reason downwards to think about like, what is the cost of this extension that I've just done? And so that's kind of similar to, you'd want something like a doubly linked tree. So you'd want a tree where the nodes know about their parents and about their children at the same time. And so kind of typical representations in functional languages like binary trees or rows trees are similar, just don't really fit this kind of thing. So we're actually currently in the middle of redesigning this, but our old thing looks something like this. So it looks like an adjacency array, basically. So we have a vector, and the vector has index data, and the index data tells you the name of the node, the kind of indices of the children, indices of the parents, and then we have kind of a label of the edge. I mean, this is not a great representation, and it's a really good way to get a lot of errors, like index errors especially. but it's kind of hard to come up with a pure functional representation that is good for doing the kind of recursion we want to do. And the other thing we want is we want to be able to do kind of these memoized traversals. So like I was saying, we want to do a traversal where we start at the leaves, go to the root, and we might want to collect lots of different data as we're going along. We might want to collect different kinds of character data or other things that we want to kind of memoize in our tree computation. And the way we do that is kind of interesting, so I thought I'd go through it. So with this kind of adjacency map representation, we do this thing where we have a memoized vector, and essentially what it is it's something that's meant to be passed into this generate memo function. And the idea is this is a generate function that's written with open recursion. And so you can build up memo vectors, which we then use to produce the actual vector. And the vector is meant to be kind of the vector of adjacency information as we go along. And so the kind of thing you can do with this is you can pass in a function which is defined on the leaves, and you pass it in a way to do recursion in the rest of the graph, and then it can kind of do it for free. And a key thing for us here is, so this is kind of a continuation passing representation of a generate function. And one of the key things is we have this kind of class that's Cartesian, which allows you to take two memo vectors and get a pair of them. And what that means is basically, as you're doing this kind of computation, you can build up pairs of things you're collecting as you go along. And that allows you to kind of do single pass traversals. But this is not the nicest way to do things, but it's just what we've kind of come up with for doing the kinds of things we want. So yeah, this is just meant to be a kind of example of the kinds of problems we kind of run into from using a functional language. It ends up like pure functional data structures might be difficult to work with, or we have to do these kind of tricks with kind of continuation passing style to do things in a single pass. And that is pretty much what we were going to talk about. This is just a slide for who our funders are. So we're funded by the American Museum of Natural History, DARPA Simplex, and the Kleberg Foundation. And thank you very much for listening.